Hello again. We're back here on the Money Corner with you during the holiday season. We're looking behind. Tonight I've got an economist with me as a guest, an economist who's a local person, Herb Heldman, a resident of Palisade Park. And with Herb, we're going to look back in terms of the recent election. We had a major election, and just wondering what are the consequences and what are the impacts of that. Herb, I didn't prep you for this, but had we had a Dukakis, or we have a Bush now, are there big economic upheavals coming along because of a continuation of Reaganomics or a distinction in Reaganomics, or are there other things coming that really we can't anticipate at this point?
Well, I don't know that we can identify what's coming. I think we can talk about several major areas that any administration would have to deal with, whether it was a Dukakis-led administration or what will be the Bush-led administration. And
the major area begins with the capital D, deficit.
That's one of the major areas. If there were...
Could you tick off a couple of the others?
I think probably the three major areas of concern would have to be identified as first, what we think of the appropriate structure should be for the gross national product, the mix of how our nation's output is generated. The deficit is obviously a major second factor. And the third, I might depart with other colleagues in the business, but I think that the attention has to be given to the deteriorating environment and our infrastructure. Represents a major third area of concern.
Let's go back for a moment to the first one. You said the gross national product, and did you say the division of the gross national product?
Yeah, the structure or the mix of the gross national product.
Now, the mix of the gross national product. For example, Gorbachev comes to the United Nations and said he's going to radically decrease his armed forces. Are you really referring to the amount of money we're spending on defense, the amount of money we're spending on medical services?
Those are the amount of money that we spend, or the proportion of our national product that's devoted to defense, probably represents the most obvious area of concern. We're spending about 6% of the gross national product now on defense outlays of one kind or another. It represents about not quite 30% of the overall federal budget. But there are other concerns as well. When we have to make decisions about, or the administration will have to make decisions about whether it wants to support certain kinds of expenditures that are desirable for the nation. Recapitalization of some of the infrastructure that's been deteriorating.
Now, the infrastructure, that's our roads, our
bridges, harbors. Everything associated with making our society work that we don't generally give much attention to.
And my assumption is, as you talk, that in the past 10, 15, 20 years, we just have stopped allocating money for maintenance, for rebuilding, for reconstruction, for new construction in those areas.
In the area of public expenditures, it's been easier to identify as outlays and channel money into outlays that it's easy to put a name on, political figure's name on, let's say, as opposed to something which goes unsung and unseen generally, such as the development of better waste disposal techniques, or the repair of a bridge which would not be recognized by anybody using the bridge, generally speaking.
Well, Herb, are you really being apolitical in your observations now, in the sense that when we think of the past administration, we hear we hear a cry about the number of people employed. We hear the cut in taxes. We don't hear too much about the kinds of things you're talking about. It seems to me that if you're talking about roads, bridges, environment, waste disposal, that should be done under Democrat or Republican. These are apolitical.
That's right, except for the fact that the choices that were made during the past administration tended to heavily favor outlays in the defense area, and there's some question about whether or not the mix of outlays within the defense area was even consistent with what the defense establishment required. But let me depart from it. I really don't feel that this is a political issue. What we're talking about is some fundamental characteristics of the way an economy works. And perhaps it's easier to make that clear by suggesting a very simple model of an economy and observing what happens if you use your resources in one way or another. Let's suppose that you have a total economy that consists of a labor force of 10 people. And that economy has what is typical in the United States of 2.5 persons per household. That means you've got an overall population of about 25 people with 10 people working. Now, in the normal circumstances, if everybody works and produces goods that are going to be consumed by those households, shelter, food, and so on, then all of the productive activity associated with those workers is going to be thought of as positive in terms of enhancing the welfare of the entire population. Suppose we make a very radical departure from that kind of a pattern. We say that suddenly there's a threat from the outside, external to this little economy, and that everybody who works now has to devote their energies to something unrelated to producing things for their households. They have to produce weapons, let's say. So now we have no production going on for our households, no food, no services, and so on, and everybody's devoting themselves to producing weapons. Well, the kind of choice you make when you do that is to say we're going to allow some deterioration to occur in our capacity to satisfy human consumption needs, say, on behalf of some threat that has to be met.
Yeah, energy is not going into leisure, and energy is not going into maintenance of the roof, and I see what you mean.
This simplistic model is essentially what actually occurs at the national level,
right,
except that it isn't as simple. And we don't make the choice as radically as having the entire labor force focusing on peacetime pursuits and household needs, nor do we have the entire labor force devoted to defense needs. We have to find an appropriate mix. And one of the major choices that any government has to make is to find out what that mix is, what's the most productive mix that's possible. In the past decade or so, we've been pursuing a pattern in which we've devoted out of our national resources a very substantial part of our energies to defense needs or defense expenditures, far more so than is the case for a number of our allies. And one of the byproducts of that particular pattern of expenditure has been that we've diverted resources from what were essentially productivity-enhancing resources, which would strengthen our ability to compete effectively in a world economy, in favor of taking on the responsibility for being the policeman, you might say, of the international arena, for the Western nations at any rate. And we've fallen behind in terms of our relative capabilities with respect to some of our trading partners.
Herb, for the moment, I'm going to play the role of the audience and toss some popular notions out at you, and you might agree and you might challenge them. But you explain, and you've helped us understand that one of the reasons that we have been less competitive as a trading group, a trading power on the world scene, was the amount of resources we've devoted to defense and energy and military buildups, whereas another nation, I assume like Japan, has had a civilian economy. But many people tell me that one of the reasons the United States is less potent as a trading partner is because it's always facing cheap foreign labor units, cheap labor competition. The people in Asia earn $3 and $4 an hour. American worker earns $10 to $12 an hour. Would you acknowledge that as well, or are we talking about two different things? Or has the average American identified the wrong reason for the lack of competitiveness in American trade right now?
I think we have a mixed picture there. I think partly what you have is even when you characterize the Far East as being an area that has a pool of cheap labor.
That's inaccurate?
Well, it's inaccurate to the extent that Japan is no longer in that category.
Labor costs in Japan have been rising.
Labor costs in Japan have risen to such an extent that it's now cheaper for Japan to have its automobile manufacturers produce cars in the United States and export them back to Japan. Because on a relative basis, it's cheaper to produce in the United States. Now, why that occurs is partly because of the way the U.S. dollar has deteriorated and relative to other currencies in the world. I was trying to keep it a little simpler than that in terms of identifying what kind of choice you have to make as a nation as to how you want to mix your productive resources.
Well, I want to continue with this. I find it very interesting. It's an explanation that I have not heard before. For example, most people acknowledge that we have lost the competitiveness in the whole area of electronics. The VCR is an Asian product. Many parts.
Let me correct you. The VCR was invented in the United States,
but never marketed and never developed.
We have one manufacturer, only one left, who I believe who's manufacturing VCRs. But the fact is that we did lose an advantage in our marketing programs and our manufacturing by virtue of the fact that we allowed the advantage on the manufacturing side to slip away from us. A lot of the technology that we generated has been exploited by others, and to our disadvantage from the point of view of international trade development.
Yeah. It may be difficult for me. You may object to my trying to politicize the discussion, but the whole premise of the past election campaign was, look how well off we are, and look at the number of jobs we have now. Look at how many segments of our society have grown and have prospered and are now robust. You seem to be challenging that.
Yes, I am. I don't have the same view of the quality of this prosperity as is generally being, or as was put forth in the course of the campaign. As an example, we have substantial employment. We have had a substantial decrease in unemployment in the country it's down to about 5.5% at this point. But the quality of that employment isn't as good as it used to be. I'll cite just one statistic. If you look at the average earnings of a manufacturing worker in the United States over the past 6 or 7 years, you find that his average weekly earnings in real dollar terms has actually declined. Not by a great deal, but a few dollars a week. So that what was characteristic of the United States for many years when we thought of prosperity bringing not only high employment but also increasing real income to people who were working, that hasn't been as true in this past prosperity.
So we've been having, what you're saying is we've been having a declining standard of living, or that's indicative of a decline in the standard of living.
Some segments of our population have certainly not been participating as fully in this prosperity as has been.
And is the indication of the decline in the standard of living the fact that more people in a family, like more women, have to work now in order for the family to earn the same amount of dollars to maintain its?
Well, I'd say probably that's an easy explanation.
Services.
I think it's true. I think it's true that the rise of the two-worker household has accelerated in the past decade.
All right, Herb, hold that thought for a moment. We're going to break for an intermission. We'll be back with you in just a minute. We'll try to continue this economic analysis of where we are and where we're going. Stay with us, please. Economist and economic consultant. Actually, he works with the banking industry throughout the Northeast. But Herb is an astute observer of the economic scene. He has been for about 30 years. He's had a wide experience in many, many phases of economics. And I was hoping, and I am trying to prod him, to talk a little more about the impact of the new administration and where the economy is going. And I guess, Herb, as I try to prod you, much of the policy decision of the past 8 years kind of influenced what the United States is in for in the near future.
That's correct, yeah.
I want to, okay, Herb, I want to get a couple more things on the table. For example, many people forecast now that we're going to pay a price for the kind of deficit we've been carrying during the Reagan years. I think, for example, we talk about the affluence and the prosperity of the Reagan years, or some people talk about the affluence and the prosperity of the Reagan years, and yet Benson, during the campaign, came along and said, look, if I wrote $80 billion worth of hot checks, I'd have a prosperity too. So some economists say perhaps you've got a prosperity, but it may be a very shallow kind of prosperity, and a prosperity which may not be long-lived. Now, would you like to characterize this? And hopefully your characterization will kind of give us some insight in terms of where you see us going over the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, if you take a very simplistic view, once again, just think in terms of the individual household or individual business. If you have access to funds that go beyond what your immediate earnings are, you can spend more money, and you
become a big borrower.
You can borrow and use the funds that you borrow to improve your personal circumstances, whether it be better machines for your business or more services and goods in the household. But you've borrowed the money, and the householder recognizes and the business recognizes that that's not a free trip, that you pay for that money in the form of interest, and that eventually you have to pay it back.
Mm-hmm. And there's no question that the United States is going in that direction.
There's no question that the United States has borrowed heavily, and in fact that the general consensus is that much of the boom of the past 8 years, our prosperity, has been directly attributable to the fact that we have borrowed very, very heavily on the international scene. In fact, so heavily that we went from being a major creditor nation, the largest creditor nation in the world, to the largest debtor nation in the world in the past 8 years. Now the United States has to pay that back at some point, pay those excess funds back. What we've done, in effect, is say, we'll borrow and spend today and enjoy the benefits of the confidence that others have in us and being able to repay the principal at some point. But we're not paying it today. We're passing that debt along to our children or the subsequent generations who will have to pay it back. I can give you an example of how serious it can be if you keep going in that direction. And you need only look at several Latin American countries right now whose standards of living have been seriously reduced as a result of the fact that the indebtedness which they incurred as part of their national effort to improve their circumstances got so far out of hand that, together with some unexpected economic reverses in their international trade, produced, such as the drop of oil prices, produced so serious a setback that they're actually declining. Standard of living is going down in Mexico, Venezuela, several countries, Argentina, Brazil, Nigeria, and so on. We see a somewhat comparable situation with a major power in Russia. One of the interesting commentaries that was made as a result of the examination of the effects of the earthquake that occurred recently in Armenia was that it appears as though the Russians keep getting, that is, Gorbachev and his policy of perestroika seems to be running into unexpected setbacks, which are making it increasingly difficult. Chernobyl was one example. $13 billion worth of repairs generated as a result of the Chernobyl incident, that is the
nuclear accident.
The nuclear accident at Chernobyl was a terrific blow to the efforts of trying to rebuild or redirect resources in the Russian economy, which was acknowledged by the Russians. Now they have an even bigger blow with the effects of trying to absorb and overcome the enormous capital outlays that are going to be required to repair the damage resulting from this Armenian earthquake. I mention that not because the United States is comparable in scale to Russia, and we have a much bigger economy, we have much greater resources at the moment, we have a much wealthier nation. But Russia is also a big power, and the fact is that if large powers such as Russia can run into this kind of circumstances, there's no guarantee that the United States couldn't also be confronted with the same kind of problem down the line, say a decade or so, if we continue the current pattern.
But many people would say that using a constructive step of raising taxes and starting to pay some of the bills would be one way that you avoid the prophecy, the negative prophecy that you just talked about in 10 years.
Obviously, I use the doom and gloom kind of orientation in describing this, and But there are some other aspects to this which are probably even more serious given in a more realistic setting. Even if the United States, even if the government shifts its policies and manages to find some way to at least stabilize the deficit, if not actually reduce it, whether it be through enhancing revenues by raising taxes or some other means, and reducing expenditures, whether it be in the military or non-military area, if somehow or other we stabilize it and even come down with it, with our deficits, we still have another problem, and that is that one aspect of the government's response that has become generally accepted over the past several decades to a downturn in the economy is to prime the pump, to actually go into debt, to produce, to spend more than we have coming in at the government.
Stimulate employment.
To stimulate employment, to stimulate the economy. But we've used up a lot of our credit. If we're running at a deficit, we increase the difficulty of being able to go to the borrowing trough, as it were, to obtain more funds to prime the pump if we have to.
Yeah.
So it becomes increasingly necessary to try to get the budget deficit into shape, if only because, in practical terms, we're probably not going to go down the tube, but in real terms, we need the flexibility at the government level to be able to combat recession if it should appear on the scene.
Herb, we're now, I believe that the current expansion is one of the longest on record. And whenever we get one of these very, very long expansions, people start saying, well, perhaps the business cycle no longer exists. And perhaps the specter of recession is no longer with us. Now, certainly the recession that took place under Carter, which really I think was engineered by Volcker in order to stabilize credit again, or stabilize or restrain inflation, is still vivid in our mind. The 18% prime, I think, is just a short period away in the past. Do you foresee a recurrence of something like this? I'm not asking you when and whether we'll have a recession, but my assumption is you really would not subscribe to the theory that the business cycle is no longer a valid part of our life, or is no longer with us.
I've been in this business, and the business that I'm in, for some time, and I think many people who are like myself are in this business would be hard-pressed to say that we can fine-tune an economy so well that we can control recession and eliminate it from the vocabulary. I don't think that's the case. I think that
then that's wishful thinking.
I think that's wishful thinking. We have learned a lot about how to moderate the negative impacts of recessions and deal with them.
And yet some of our ability to moderate are limited by the point you just made, the deficit and the inability to borrow it.
One of the concerns of the professional economist has to be, if you take away the tools that are available by virtue of mishandling the economy over time, then you run the risk of not being able to introduce the kinds of tools to control recessions or moderate them that we know are available or can be used.
Let me ask another question about the negative impact of our economic policies in the past 8 years. And I'm really not an advocate nor an opponent of what went on in the past 8 years. I'm trying to elicit information from you. Would you be critical of the past 8 years in the economic policies because of the way it has watered down our ability to do research and development and primary innovation, watered down or diluted our educational capacity? Are these areas of criticism that you have?
Well,
I'm
yes,
thinking this lack of competitiveness now.
One of the anxieties I would have is that and I mentioned before one area that I think is an area of major concern, and that's environmental deterioration of our infrastructure. I include as part of that deterioration process a deterioration of our educational system, which is essentially a capital-producing, enhancing kind of activity. The better we educate our population, the more effective we are in performing in a complex economy.
But how do we measure or acknowledge that we have watered down or impaired our educational system in the past 8 years? Is that objectively verifiable?
Well, the educators say so. The educators claim that there have been serious shortcomings in our educational system. Educators will claim that they're not getting enough funds to support research and development at the university level, pure research, that is. And educators will also say that the quality of the performance of our schools in at the elementary and secondary school levels has not kept pace with what the nation deserves and needs. In fact, I think it was Mr. Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under President Reagan, made the point himself. He was one of the most vocal critics of the quality of our educational system and the shortcomings in it. The whole area of not providing the kind of money that's needed to support activities which don't pay off for many, many years is an area that I think that requires much more attention. And I think partly what we've had is a situation in which the policies of the past administrations have contributed to a dilution of the amount of money going into these capital enhancing and productivity enhancing kinds of activities, the infrastructure of the economy.
Herb, thank you. My guest tonight has been Herb Heldman, who lives here in Palisade Park. Herb is a journeyman economist. He's an economic consultant and is president of his own economic firm. You've been very provocative, and you've given us a good deal to think about. I hope you haven't been overly depressing for our audience here in the middle of the holiday season, but I'll be back with you again after the holiday season. I hope you and your family have a great one. And Herb, I want to thank you for being with me tonight. Good night.